A forgotten man in a wheelchair, ignored by the rich at a lavish New Year's Eve party, suddenly becomes their only hope when masked assailants strike. But as the night unravels, his dark past reveals a truth no one could have imagined. The grand ballroom of the Delmont Estates sparkled with opulence. Gilded chandeliers cast their warm glow on the crowd below, where the city's elite mingled in expensive gowns and tailored suits. Glasses of champagne clinked as laughter and conversation filled the room, a symphony of wealth and privilege. The air buzzed with anticipation for the clock to strike midnight, marking the start of a new year. In the midst of this exuberant celebration sat Lucio, a man whose presence was as quiet as it was overlooked. In his 60s, he occupied a sleek, polished wheelchair that seemed to blend into the ornate decor of the room. Despite his tailored suit, his gray hair and lined face drew no second glances from the attendees. For them, he was a shadow, a forgotten detail in the grandeur of the evening. Rosa, a young woman standing near the towering windows, observed the room with an inquisitive eye. Her age set her apart from the older crowd, but her sharp mind made her a silent chronicler of the event. She noticed Lucio almost immediately, his figure hunched slightly as he sat apart from the bustling crowd. His eyes, though, were alive, dark and probing, scanning the room with an intensity that contradicted his otherwise subdued demeanor. Curiosity tugged at her. Who was he? Why was he here if no one seemed to acknowledge him? Rosa lingered, her gaze flickering between the guests and the enigmatic man, whose face betrayed no emotion. The music swelled, a lively orchestra filling the ballroom with a jubilant waltz. Around her, guests twirled in synchronized elegance, their laughter and mirth forming a stark contrast to the man seated in silence. Rosa noticed the occasional glance cast in his direction, fleeting, disinterested, dismissive. Lucio, however, seemed unbothered by the lack of attention. He sat with the stillness of someone who had grown accustomed to being unseen. The clock neared 11:30, and the party's energy reached a crescendo. Waiters weaved through the crowd, offering trays of hors d'oeuvres and refilling flutes of champagne. Rosa remained near the window, partially hidden by the heavy velvet drapes. She wasn't a part of this world, but tonight she found herself captivated by its peculiarities, particularly by the ignored man with the piercing gaze. Then, something shifted. Outside, muffled by the laughter and music, came the faint hum of engines. Rosa glanced through the window and saw the faint outline of a vehicle parked just beyond the estate's wrought iron gates. A second vehicle followed, its headlights cutting through the night like daggers. She frowned, her instincts flaring. Inside, the celebration carried on unabated. Rosa scanned the room, but no one else had noticed, not even Lucio, whose sharp eyes remained fixed on the dance floor. She hesitated, unsure whether to trust her gut or dismiss her unease as imagination. But then she saw it, the silhouettes of figures exiting the vehicles. 4, maybe 5 men, moving with purpose toward the mansion's side entrance. The soft glow of their flashlights betrayed their stealth. Rosa's chest tightened. This wasn't normal. Something was wrong. Her gaze darted back to Lucio. He sat as still as before, but something had changed. His eyes, which moments ago seemed to drift aimlessly, now locked onto the ballroom's grand entrance. His hands rested lightly on the arms of his wheelchair, but his posture had straightened ever so slightly. Rosa turned back to the window, her pulse quickening. The figures outside were closer now, their intentions clear. The party continued to swirl around her, oblivious to the approaching storm. And yet somehow, she felt certain that Lucio was not as unaware as he appeared. The clock ticked toward midnight, the promise of a new year mingling with the tension that neither Rosa nor Lucio could ignore. The gilded walls of the Delmont estate seemed to tremble as the front doors burst open with a deafening crash. The jovial music screeched to a halt, leaving a stunned silence that was quickly filled by screams. A group of masked men stormed the ballroom, their black-clad figures a stark intrusion into the golden opulence of the celebration. Guests froze in place, their champagne flutes slipping from trembling hands and shattering against the marble floor. The leader of the group, a broad-shouldered man with piercing eyes visible through his mask, raised a pistol high above his head. "Everyone, down!" he bellowed, his voice cutting through the panicked murmurs. "Hands where we can see them. Nobody moves and no one gets hurt." The crowd obeyed, dropping to their knees in terror. The intruders fanned out, sweeping through the room with calculated precision. They moved like wolves among sheep, gathering jewelry, watches, and wallets from trembling hands. The leader, Caio, as one of his men called him, commanded authority, his movements cold and methodical. In a shadowed corner of the room, Rosa crouched behind a column, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. She clenched her fists, feeling the icy grip of fear as she watched the scene unfold. Her mind raced, searching for a way out, but every exit seemed guarded, every path blocked. Her gaze flicked to Lucio. He hadn't moved. Sitting in his wheelchair, he appeared unnervingly calm amidst the chaos. His hands rested on his lap, his face impassive as if he were merely observing a mundane spectacle. To the invaders, he was invisible, an old man in a chair, no threat and no consequence. But Rosa noticed the subtle flicker in his eyes, the way they darted from one masked figure to another, calculating, assessing. There was no fear in him, no panic. He seemed to study them as if memorizing their movements. Kaio's voice rang out again, this time more menacing. "You!" he barked, pointing at one of the guests. "Get over here!" The man stumbled forward, pale and shaking, as Kaio ripped a diamond-studded watch from his wrist. "Anyone else want to make this harder than it needs to be?" The crowd cowered further, heads bowed and eyes downcast. All except Lucio. Kaio's gaze eventually landed on him, and his lips curled into a cruel smirk. "Well, well," he sneered, striding toward the wheelchair-bound man. "Looks like we've got ourselves an easy mark." Rosa's stomach churned as Kaio stopped in front of Lucio, looming over him like a predator toying with its prey. The other intruders laughed, jeering at the old man's apparent helplessness. "Let's see what Grandpa's got for us," Kaio said, yanking at the pocket square in Lucio's suit. The fabric tore free, but Lucio remained silent, his expression unmoved. His calmness only seemed to fuel Kaio's anger. "Think you're too good to react, huh?" Kaio taunted, his voice dripping with malice. "Get up." When Lucio didn't respond, Kaio's patience snapped. He grabbed the arms of the wheelchair, his grip tightening as he leaned in. "I said, get up." Rosa bit her lip to keep from crying out, her heart pounding. She wanted to intervene, to scream, but fear rooted her in place. She watched as the men began to pull Lucio from his chair, their laughter echoing through the ballroom like a twisted melody. Lucio's eyes remained fixed on Kaio, cold and unwavering. For a fleeting moment, Rosa thought she saw something in them, a glint of steel, a quiet promise of defiance. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, leaving her questioning whether she had imagined it. The room descended into chaos as the assailants continued their rampage. But Rosa couldn't tear her eyes away from the enigmatic man in the wheelchair, whose silence screamed louder than any words. The atmosphere in the ballroom grew heavier as Kaio and his men focused their attention on Lucio. The other guests averted their eyes, unwilling to witness the humiliation of the old man, though their hushed murmurs betrayed their unease. The leader of the intruders, clearly relishing the moment, gestured for his men to haul Lucio out of his chair. "Let's see how tough you are now," Kaio sneered, watching as two of his accomplices grabbed Lucio under the arms and yanked him onto the cold marble floor. The impact was audible, a sharp thud that reverberated through the room. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but no one dared to intervene. Rosa's chest tightened as she watched from her hidden vantage point, her hands balled into fists, nails digging into her palms as she silently willed someone to step forward. But the fear gripping the crowd was palpable, paralyzing them into inaction. Lucio lay sprawled on the floor, his body awkwardly twisted. Despite the indignity, his face remained eerily calm. His eyes, however, were different. They bore into Kaio with a quiet, unsettling intensity that seemed to unnerve even the brash leader. Kaio crouched down beside Lucio, his smirk widening as he grabbed the man by the collar. "What's the matter, old man? Got nothing to say?" He pulled Lucio closer, his voice dropping to a mocking whisper. "You're just a relic. You don't belong here. No one even cares that you're—" In a flash, Kaio's words were cut short by the faintest twitch of Lucio's lips, not a smile, but something colder, more deliberate. Rosa caught it, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt crept into her fear. What kind of man reacts to this with such composure? "Get up!" Kaio demanded again, his voice louder now, filled with frustration. He gestured to his men, who jeered and laughed as they kicked Lucio's legs, mocking his inability to rise. The scene was grotesque, a cruel spectacle of power wielded without conscience. But even as the humiliation escalated, Lucio's silence persisted. His lack of reaction only seemed to fuel Kaio's fury. The leader reached for a nearby champagne flute, still half full, and poured its contents over Lucio's head. The liquid ran down his face and soaked into his suit, yet he remained still, his gaze never wavering. Rosa couldn't take her eyes off him. There was something unsettling about his calm, something that made her believe he wasn't as helpless as he seemed. She felt it in the way his chest rose and fell with deliberate slowness, in the measured tension of his hands as they pressed against the floor. It was as if he were waiting for something. The guests continued to watch in horrified silence, their fear rendering them complicit. Rosa's anger burned hotter with each passing second. How could they just stand there? How could she just stand there? Suddenly, Caio straightened and turned to the room, spreading his arms wide as if to address an audience. "Let this be a lesson," he announced, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Doesn't matter how rich or important you think you are. When it comes down to it, you're all the same. Pathetic." His men laughed, their harsh voices grating against the oppressive silence. Lucio remained on the floor, unmoving, but Rosa noticed it again, that flicker in his eyes. It wasn't defeat. It wasn't resignation. It was something darker, something sharper. For the first time, Rosa felt a strange, unshakable certainty. This wasn't over. The laughter of Caio and his men echoed through the ballroom, a cruel and discordant melody against the heavy silence of the crowd. Lucio remained on the floor, his body still and his face inscrutable. His soaked suit clung to his frame, and yet something about him seemed to change. Rosa, still hidden, watched intently, her breath caught in her throat. Caio leaned down again, his arrogance evident in the way he loomed over Lucio. "You're done," he sneered, his tone dripping with disdain. "Crawl, old man. Show everyone how pathetic you really are." The tension in the room reached its breaking point. Rosa wanted to scream, to intervene, but her legs felt like stone. Her gaze darted to Lucio, hoping against reason that he would somehow rise above this humiliation. And then, it happened. In a single fluid motion, Lucio's arm shot out, his hand locking around the wrist of one of the masked men. The suddenness of the movement froze everyone in place, their laughter dying in their throats. The man yelped, his weapon clattering to the floor as Lucio twisted his wrist with practiced precision. The ballroom fell into stunned silence. Before anyone could react, Lucio pivoted, using the momentum to sweep the assailant's legs out from under him. The man crashed to the floor, unconscious, before he even hit the ground. The crowd gasped as if awakening from a collective stupor. Rosa's heart raced. This was not the act of a helpless man. This was the precision of a predator who had lain dormant. The other intruders snapped out of their shock, raising their weapons toward Lucio. But he was already moving, faster than anyone had anticipated. Using the fallen man's weapon as leverage, Lucio swung upward, disarming another attacker with a strike that sent the man reeling backward into a nearby table. The sound of breaking glass punctuated the chaos. "Stop him!" Caio bellowed, his voice laced with fury. His men hesitated, unsure how to approach the man they had just mocked. Lucio's movements were efficient, almost surgical, and his expression remained eerily calm. It was as though he were operating on instinct, his body a machine fine-tuned for combat. Rosa's pulse thundered in her ears as she watched Lucio maneuver with a grace that seemed impossible for someone in his condition. He retrieved a piece of broken glass from the floor and held it defensively, his eyes scanning the room like a predator, assessing its prey. For the first time that night, Caio and his men looked uncertain. "Don't just stand there, get him!" Caio shouted, his bravado faltering. Lucio didn't wait. He disappeared into the crowd with a speed and agility that defied logic. Guests scattered, their panic creating a human shield that slowed the intruder's pursuit. Rosa, still hidden, watched in awe as Lucio used the chaos to his advantage, vanishing into the labyrinthine corridors of the mansion. "What the hell is going on?" one of the masked men hissed, his voice trembling. Their confidence was unraveling, replaced by the first threads of fear. Caio cursed under his breath, his jaw tightening as he barked orders. Rosa, emboldened by the shift in power, moved cautiously from her hiding spot. She kept to the shadows, her eyes darting between the assailants and the direction Lucio had disappeared. The air crackled with tension, the guests too terrified to move, the intruders too stunned to act decisively. From somewhere deeper in the mansion came the sound of something breaking, followed by a muffled cry. Rosa's stomach flipped. She didn't know where Lucio had gone or what he was planning, but one thing was clear. The man who had been ignored and humiliated moments ago was no victim. He was something far more dangerous. And now the hunters had become the hunted. The mansion, once alive with music and laughter, had descended into a labyrinth of fear and silence. The gilded corridors now served as a battlefield, their ornate furnishings and luxurious tapestries witness to a deadly game of cat and mouse. Lucio had vanished into the shadows, leaving Caio and his men visibly unsettled. "Spread out," Caio barked, his tone sharper, more desperate. "Find him, now!" The intruders moved cautiously, their earlier confidence shattered. They scanned every corner, their weapons trembling slightly in their hands. The weight of the mansion's silence pressed down on them, each creak of the floorboards and rustle of fabric amplifying their unease. Hidden in the shadows of a storage alcove, Rosa watched as two of the men passed her, their movements jerky and uncoordinated. They were afraid. She could see it in the way their eyes darted to every flickering shadow, every imagined threat. Her heart pounded in her chest as she debated her next move. She wasn't like Lucio, but perhaps she could help him in her own way. Deeper within the mansion, Lucio moved like a phantom. His familiarity with the space was evident. Every turn and hidden passage seemed to fold around him, shielding him from his pursuers. He didn't rush. His steps were deliberate, silent, his mind calculating every variable. The first trap was simple. In the dimly lit gallery, Lucio waited, crouched behind a large marble statue. One of the assailants entered cautiously, his flashlight sweeping the room. Lucio didn't hesitate. He pushed the heavy statue just as the man stepped beneath it. The sound of stone meeting flesh was sickening, and the man crumpled without a sound. Back in the ballroom, Caio clenched his fists as the radio crackled to life. "We've got a man down," came the panicked voice of one of his men. "Something's not right. He's hunting us." Caio's jaw tightened. "Then hunt him back," he growled, though the flicker of doubt in his voice betrayed his growing frustration. Rosa, still moving quietly through the mansion, found herself in the dimly lit library. Her fingers brushed against a dusty shelf as she spotted something, a small switch hidden among the carvings. Curiosity overcame her caution, and she pressed it. A soft click echoed through the room as a section of the wall slid open, revealing a narrow passage. She hesitated, then slipped inside, her breath shallow. The passage was cramped and smelled of aged wood and dust. It led to a small vantage point overlooking a hallway, where two more intruders searched. From her position, she could see Lucio emerging from another corridor, moving silently toward the men. Rosa had a decision to make. If she stayed quiet, Lucio would have to face them alone. But if she acted, she might give him an advantage. Steeling herself, she whispered through the grate, "To your left." Lucio's head tilted slightly, acknowledging the warning without looking toward her. The distraction was enough. As one of the men turned, Lucio struck, delivering a precise blow to the back of his neck. The other spun around, but it was too late. Lucio disarmed him with fluid efficiency, leaving him gasping on the floor. Rosa exhaled shakily. She hadn't been caught, and Lucio had gained the upper hand. Still, her involvement was risky, and she knew it. Elsewhere, the remaining intruders regrouped, their fear now palpable. Caio paced furiously, his mind racing to regain control. "He's just one man," he snarled. "You're letting an old cripple take you down?" But even as he spoke, doubt seeped into his words. Lucio wasn't just a man. He was something else entirely, something the intruders couldn't comprehend or contain. The mansion's grand clock began to chime the hour, its deep, resonant tones cutting through the tension. Rosa watched from her hidden position as Lucio disappeared once more into the shadows, leaving behind only the evidence of his calculated hunt. The predator was far from finished. The mansion's labyrinthine corridors echoed with the whispers of the past, each creak of the floorboards and rustle of fabric carrying memories too heavy to be forgotten. Lucio leaned against a wall in the dimly lit wine cellar, his breath steady despite the toll of his calculated hunt. He removed his jacket, revealing a blood-stained shirt beneath. The pain in his side flared, a souvenir from a close encounter earlier. Yet his expression remained unreadable. The faint scent of oak and aged wine filled the room, but Lucio's mind was far from the present. As he adjusted the strap of his shoulder holster, memories flooded his senses. They came unbidden, like a tide he could not stem. Years ago, he had been a man of precision and purpose, trained to eliminate threats with ruthless efficiency. Governments, corporations, even private individuals had sought his skills. He remembered the long nights of preparation, the meticulous planning, the cold satisfaction of a job well executed. Lucio had been a ghost, feared, respected, and utterly without equal. But ghosts carried their own burdens. Rosa, moving cautiously through the mansion, stumbled upon an abandoned study. Papers were strewn across the desk, and the faint scent of cigar smoke lingered in the air. As she scanned the room, something caught her eye, a worn photograph partially hidden under a stack of documents. She picked it up, her breath hitching. The image was of a younger Lucio, standing in a military uniform, his expression as sharp and unreadable as it was now. Around him were others, soldiers or perhaps mercenaries, their faces hardened by experience. The edges of the photograph were frayed, as though it had been handled countless times. "Who are you, Lucio?" she wondered. As Rosa examined the room, her mind piecing together fragments of the enigmatic man's life, Lucio was grappling with his own ghosts. He could still hear the voice of his old handler, a man who had once praised him as the perfect weapon. He remembered the missions that had taken him to the darkest corners of the world, places where morality was a luxury and survival was the only law. The memory of his final mission loomed large. It had been a betrayal, a job meant to silence him after he'd grown too dangerous. The explosion that followed had left him broken, confined to a wheelchair, and stripped of the life he had known. He had vanished, retreating into the shadows, content to let the world forget him, until tonight. Another memory surfaced, the sound of shattering glass, the searing heat of flames, the deafening roar of collapsing buildings. It wasn't the mansion he was hearing, but a distant battlefield, a place where his skills had once reigned supreme. His jaw tightened, and his hand instinctively moved to his side, feeling the faint scar beneath his shirt. Rosa's voice echoed faintly in his mind. "To your left," she had whispered earlier. That small act of trust had anchored him in the present, reminding him that tonight wasn't about reliving the past. It was about survival. In the study, Rosa found another clue, a small leather-bound journal tucked into a drawer. She opened it to find pages filled with precise handwriting, notes that detailed plans, maps, and cryptic entries. One line stood out: "A predator does not hunt for sport, he hunts for survival." Her heart raced. Lucio was no ordinary man. He was a relic of a world she didn't understand, a figure both dangerous and fascinating. She felt a strange mix of fear and admiration for him, unsure whether to trust him or keep her distance. Above, the faint sound of footsteps echoed. Rosa quickly closed the journal and slipped back into the shadows. The hunt wasn't over, and danger still lurked around every corner. For Lucio, the past was both a weapon and a burden. But tonight, it was clear that he couldn't run from it any longer. The mansion had become a fortress under siege. Caio's fury burned hotter with every passing second, his voice echoing through the halls as he barked orders to his remaining men. "Check every corner, he's not getting out of here alive." The assailants, their confidence now shattered, moved with desperation. They swept through rooms with flashlights cutting through the gloom, their weapons drawn and their nerves fraying. Every sound, the creak of a floorboard, the soft groan of the wind, set them on edge. In the shadows of a hidden passageway, Lucio leaned against the wall, his breathing shallow. Blood seeped from a gash on his side, the price of a close encounter earlier. He clutched a strip of fabric against the wound, his mind racing. He was outnumbered and injured, but his resolve remained unbroken. The mansion was still his territory, and he would defend it until the end. Meanwhile, Rosa moved carefully through the darkened corridors, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spotted Lucio moments earlier, his figure barely visible as he disappeared through a concealed door. She wanted to help, but she also knew her limits. Instead, she focused on finding something, anything, that could give them an advantage. She stumbled upon a hidden alcove and found it, a narrow staircase leading downward. She hurried back to find Lucio, her movement swift but cautious. When she finally reached him, his face was pale, but his eyes still burned with determination. She pointed to the passage. "There's a way out," she whispered. Lucio glanced at the staircase, then shook his head. "Not yet," he said, his voice calm despite the chaos. "This ends here." The siege was closing in, but Lucio had no intention of retreating. The grand ballroom, once a stage of opulence and celebration, now bore the scars of chaos. Broken glass glittered on the marble floor, and the golden chandeliers cast flickering shadows as the mansion's generator sputtered under the strain. It was here, in this hollowed-out monument to luxury, that Lucio and Caio finally came face to face. Lucio entered first, his movements measured, his hand clutching his side where the makeshift bandage stemmed the worst of the bleeding. The weight of exhaustion bore down on him, but his eyes remained sharp, unwavering. He stood in the center of the room, his wheelchair discarded somewhere in the chaos. His very presence seemed to draw the air from the space. Caio stepped in moments later, his gun raised and his face twisted in rage. Sweat glistened on his brow, a testament to the tension that had gripped him since the hunt began. He leveled his weapon at Lucio, his knuckles white around the grip. "You've caused me enough trouble, old man," he spat, his voice thick with anger. "This ends now." Lucio didn't flinch. Instead, he raised his hand slowly, palm outward, a gesture of eerie calm. "You've already lost," he said, his tone even, almost dispassionate. "Your men are scattered. You're alone." Caio's laugh was sharp and brittle. Big words for a man who can barely stand. He took a step closer, the barrel of his gun trained on Lucio's chest. "I should have put a bullet in you the moment I saw you." "Then do it," Lucio said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. His calmness was unnerving, and Caio hesitated, his finger twitching on the trigger. That hesitation was all Lucio needed. In a blur of motion, Lucio moved, his hand snapping upward to grab a heavy candlestick from a nearby table. He swung with precision, striking Caio's wrist and sending the gun skittering across the floor. Before Caio could recover, Lucio delivered a calculated blow to his knee, dropping him to the ground with a pained shout. The fight was brutal and swift, a testament to Lucio's training and unyielding resolve. Despite his injuries, he moved with purpose, every strike deliberate. Caio, for all his bravado, was no match for the predator who had awakened in Lucio. In the end, Caio lay sprawled on the marble floor, his chest heaving as he gasped for breath. Lucio stood over him, battered but victorious. "This is your last mistake," Lucio said, his voice low, almost a whisper. Then, with the same eerie calm, he turned and walked away, leaving Caio defeated and broken in the ruins of the ballroom. The echoes of the battle lingered in the grand ballroom, but the chaos itself had subsided. The glittering chandeliers swayed gently, casting fractured light over a scene of destruction. Shattered glass crunched underfoot as the remaining guests slowly emerged from their hiding places, their faces pale and their breaths unsteady. The opulence of the mansion now felt like a distant memory, overshadowed by the terror of the night. Lucio stood near the edge of the room, his frame leaning slightly against a toppled table. Blood stained his shirt, and his breathing was labored, but his posture remained composed. He had returned to his wheelchair, though he sat in it now like a throne rather than a crutch. The quiet authority of his presence made him the focus of every eye in the room. The intruders had fled, their morale shattered, leaving behind only their unconscious leader, Caio, sprawled across the marble floor. His mask was gone, revealing a face twisted in defeat and fear. The guests whispered among themselves, their voices hushed as they pieced together the events of the night. Rosa approached cautiously, her hands trembling as she clutched a first aid kit she had scavenged from the study. She stopped a few steps away, hesitant to disturb the man who had single-handedly turned the tide. "You're hurt," she said softly, her voice carrying a mix of awe and concern. Lucio glanced at her, his dark eyes unreadable. He nodded once, allowing her to kneel beside him and tend to his wound. As she worked, the silence between them was heavy but not uncomfortable. Rosa wanted to speak, to ask about the man who had revealed himself to be so much more than the unassuming figure she had observed earlier in the evening. But the weight of the moment stilled her tongue. Around them, the guests began to recover, their initial shock giving way to relief and gratitude. A man in a torn tuxedo stepped forward hesitantly, his voice trembling. "You saved us. Who are you?" Lucio didn't respond immediately. He seemed to consider the question, his gaze distant as if searching for an answer himself. Finally he spoke, his voice low and firm. "Just a man doing what needed to be done." The sound of sirens pierced the night, growing louder as they approached the mansion. Police and paramedics would soon arrive, bringing with them order and questions. Lucio, however, had no intention of staying. He adjusted his wheelchair, his movements deliberate, and turned toward the door. Rosa rose to follow him, a spark of determination in her eyes. She reached into her pocket and pressed a small slip of paper into his hand. "You don't owe anyone an explanation," she said quietly. "But if you ever want to talk, you know where to find me." Lucio's gaze lingered on her for a moment, and then he nodded. Without another word, he rolled away, disappearing into the shadows of the mansion, leaving behind a room filled with whispers, gratitude, and unanswered questions. The first rays of dawn pierced the remnants of the stormy night, casting a pale light over the battered Delmont mansion. The once vibrant estate, filled hours ago with music and laughter, now lay in eerie quiet, marked by shattered glass, overturned furniture, and the lingering scent of fear. Police and paramedics swarmed the grounds, their voices and movements filling the space with the orderliness of recovery. Inside the grand ballroom, the remnants of the party huddled together, their faces drawn with exhaustion. The chaos of the night had passed, but its memory lingered like an unwelcome shadow. Rosa stood near the edge of the room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she watched the uniformed officers take statements from the guests. Her mind, however, was elsewhere. Lucio was gone. She had seen him leave before the authorities arrived, his figure disappearing into the cool morning air like a ghost retreating into the mist. The slip of paper she had given him, a hastily scribbled address and a simple message, "You're not alone," felt like her last connection to the man who had changed everything that night. Whether he would ever use it, she didn't know. A uniformed officer approached her. "Miss, are you all right?" Rosa nodded absently. "I'm fine," she replied, though the weight in her chest said otherwise. Her gaze drifted to the broken chandelier overhead, its fractured crystals reflecting faint rainbows across the marble floor. She let out a slow breath, the enormity of the night pressing down on her. Elsewhere in the mansion, Kaya was being loaded onto a stretcher, his face a mask of bruises and anger. He glared at the officers but said nothing, his silence more bitter than any outburst. His men had scattered, most of them captured, and the illusion of control he had wielded so confidently earlier was now shattered. For the guests, the ordeal had been a nightmare, but for Rosa, it had been a revelation. The man she had initially observed as an ignored figure had revealed himself to be something extraordinary, a force of precision and purpose that had turned the tides of a hopeless situation. As the last of the emergency crews packed up, Rosa found herself in the mansion's vast garden. The cool morning breeze carried the scent of damp earth and crushed flowers, and for the first time that night she allowed herself to feel the relief of survival. But it was tempered by an undeniable curiosity, a need to understand the man who had slipped away into the night. She turned toward the horizon, where the faint glow of the city lights still lingered. Somewhere out there, Lucio was moving through the world, carrying the weight of his past and the shadows of what he had done tonight. A sharp crack behind her made her turn. One of the champagne bottles left over from the night's festivities had rolled onto the stone path, its golden label catching the morning light. Rosa bent to pick it up, her fingers brushing the cool glass. A faint smile touched her lips. She stepped back inside the ballroom, now eerily empty, and found a single flute standing upright amidst the chaos. It was unbroken, its crystal catching the faint light of the chandelier overhead. She poured the champagne slowly, the fizz and foam rising to the rim, as if defying the destruction around her. Lifting the glass, she turned toward the ballroom's shattered windows, through which the first light of the new year spilled. She raised the glass higher, her voice barely a whisper, but filled with meaning. "To Lucio," she said, her words carrying into the stillness. "To the man who changed everything." The distant boom of fireworks echoed faintly, remnants of the celebrations in the city beyond. Rosa sipped the champagne, her thoughts filled with the enigmatic man who had saved them all and vanished into the dawn. And though she was alone in that moment, she felt a strange sense of connection, as if Lucio, wherever he was, might be raising a glass of his own. The story of Lucio reminds us that strength often lies hidden beneath layers of perception, waiting for the right moment to surface. It challenges us to question how we judge others and how we might act when faced with chaos and fear. Would you have stood frozen with the crowd, or found the courage to intervene like Rosa? The choices we make in moments of crisis reveal who we truly are. Click the video on your screen now to continue this journey of self-discovery and uncover more lessons hidden in unexpected stories. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to never miss an opportunity to reflect, grow, and be inspired. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next chapter of your journey.